When my husband passed away, his wealthy boss called me and said, "I found something. Come to my office right now." Then he added, "Do not tell your sister or your stepmother. You could be in danger." When I got there and saw who was waiting, I froze. Have you ever been kicked out of your own home by your family on the exact day of your husband's funeral? My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I worked in the shadows as a crisis management public relations expert for Atlanta's elite. I spent my days fixing massive scandals for politicians, athletes, and CEOs, making their worst disasters quietly disappear. But I never in a million years imagined that the biggest, most dangerous crisis of my life would be orchestrated by my own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to destroy you. The Fellowship Hall of Atlanta's largest historic church was packed wall to wall. The air was thick with the comforting scent of catered Southern food, fried chicken, collard greens, and the heavy floral perfumes of people pretending to care. It was the repast following my husband Marcus's funeral. Marcus was a brilliant, highly respected investment fund manager. He was my rock, my steadfast partner, and the only person who truly understood the depths of who I was. We had built a beautiful, quiet life together, intentionally distancing ourselves from the flashy, dramatic chaos of my family. Losing him to what the hospital casually called a sudden medical complication felt like the ground had been violently ripped out from under my feet. Yet as I stood in the corner of the crowded room, sipping a glass of lukewarm water and clutching his funeral program to my chest, I was not allowed to mourn in peace. I watched my stepmother Vivian playing the role of the devastated matriarch for the cameras and the crowds. She was draped in custom black couture, gracefully dabbing at perfectly dry eyes whenever a local politician or a wealthy socialite walked by her table. Next to her was my half-sister Dominique, wearing a black dress that was far too tight and far too short for a church gathering. Dominique was soaking up the sympathy of Marcus's wealthy colleagues like a sponge, playing the part of the heartbroken sister-in-law to absolute perfection. Vivian and Dominique had always hated me. I was the dark-skinned, natural-haired daughter from my father's first marriage. I was born and raised in a proud working-class neighborhood on the West Side before my father struck it rich in commercial real estate and married Vivian. From the very moment Vivian entered my life, she and her daughter spent their time trying to erase my existence. They spent their days climbing the social ladder of Atlanta's high society, joining exclusive country clubs and looking down on anyone who did not fit their narrow, elitist mold. Marcus had been my safe haven from all of that. He loved me for my sharp mind and my relentless hustle. He never cared that I did not grow up summering in luxury resorts or attending elite private academies. But to Vivian and Dominique, Marcus was just a shiny status symbol. He was a highly connected financial genius who served as their golden ticket into circles they desperately wanted to infiltrate. And now that my husband was gone, they saw absolutely no reason to keep up the exhausting charade of treating me like family. I was staring down at the polished floor, my heart physically aching with a grief so heavy it was hard to breathe when I saw them approaching out of the corner of my eye. Dominique was linking arms with her husband, Brad. Brad was a white financial broker with a trust fund, an arrogant swagger, and an ego that always entered the room long before he did. He had always looked at me like I was some sort of unfortunate charity case that his wife's family was tragically forced to tolerate. Today was clearly no different. He did not offer a comforting hug. He did not offer condolences for the incredible man I had just buried. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. He thrust it toward my chest, his face completely devoid of human empathy, practically forcing me to take it from his hands. "I know Marcus just passed," Brad said, his voice dripping with casual condescension. "But we need to handle business. That is a 30-day notice to vacate." I stared at the legal document in my trembling hands, then up at his smug, unbothered face. My mind, usually incredibly sharp and analytical, struggled to process his words through the thick, suffocating fog of my grief. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is my house. Marcus and I bought that house together." Brad let out a short, mocking laugh that made the blood roar in my ears. "Not anymore, Nia. Marcus was keeping secrets from you. He took out a massive loan against the property a few months ago to cover some bad investments he made in secret. He mortgaged the house to my private lending fund. He defaulted on the payments before he died, and now the property legally belongs to my firm. You have until the end of the month to pack your things and get out. Please do not make this difficult for the family." Before I could even begin to process the absolute absurdity of his claim, Dominique stepped forward. She looked me up and down with a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Let us be real, Nia," Dominique whispered venomously, keeping her voice low so the church elders chatting nearby would not overhear her cruelty. "You never belonged in that upscale neighborhood anyway. You never fit in with Marcus's sophisticated world. Now that he is not here to elevate your status and buy your way into our circles, it is time for a reality check. Pack up your cheap clothes and go back to the West Side projects where you belong. Mom and I are tired of pretending we associate with someone like you." I stood there entirely surrounded by hundreds of people eating and drinking in honor of my dead husband, while my own sister and brother-in-law casually tried to destroy my life. The paper in my hand felt impossibly heavy, but as the initial wave of shock began to recede, my professional instincts violently kicked in. As a crisis manager, my brain was extensively trained to spot inconsistencies, to look for the lie in every single statement, and to read the hidden motives behind people's actions. Marcus was a financial genius. He was meticulous, transparent, and deeply conservative with our personal money. We had no bad investments, and he absolutely despised Brad's shady, predatory business practices. He would never, under any circumstances, mortgage our dream home to Brad's lending firm. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. This was not just a cruel family dispute over property. This was a calculated, premeditated attack. My very first instinct was to tear the eviction notice to shreds and scream at them right there in the middle of the fellowship hall. I wanted to expose Vivian, Dominique, and Brad for the opportunistic parasites they truly were. I wanted to make a scene so loud that everyone in Atlanta would know their true nature. But I knew that was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to have a massive public meltdown. They wanted to point at me and tell all the wealthy, influential guests that I was unhinged, unstable, and acting like a stereotypical angry, classless woman who could not handle her emotions. They wanted to use my raw grief as a weapon to discredit me in front of Marcus's peers. So I took a deep, steadying breath. I forced my face into a mask of complete and utter neutrality. I carefully folded the paper, slipped it into my designer purse, and looked Brad dead in the eye. "I understand," I said, keeping my tone chillingly calm and polite. Brad looked visibly disappointed that I had not caused a scene, but Dominique just smirked, clearly believing they had won the ultimate victory. They turned their backs on me and walked away toward the buffet line, laughing softly with each other, leaving me standing alone with my shattered heart and a rapidly growing sense of deep suspicion. I knew I needed to investigate. I needed to look into every single one of Marcus's private accounts to find out what they had done. Just as I turned to leave the crowded church hall to find a quiet place to think, my phone vibrated intensely in my purse. I pulled it out. It was a secure text message from Isaiah Sterling. Isaiah was a legendary black billionaire in Atlanta and the head of the massive investment firm where Marcus had worked. He was a man of immense power, extreme privacy, and very few words. We rarely spoke directly. I opened the message and my blood ran instantly cold. The text read, "I found something. Come to my office right now. Do not tell your stepmother or your sister. You are in danger." I slipped out through the heavy side doors of the fellowship hall before Brad or Dominique could even notice my absence. The solid oak doors slammed shut behind me immediately, cutting off the suffocating hum of fake condolences, the clinking of glassware, and the nauseating sound of my own family performing their grief for the cameras. The thick, humid Atlanta air hit my face the moment I stepped outside, and for the first time all day, I took a real deep breath. I pulled out my phone and ordered a ride-share, standing completely still in the dark shadows of the church parking lot, pulling my black coat tightly around myself to ward off the sudden chill in my bones. When the black sedan finally pulled up to the curb, I slid silently into the back seat and gave the driver nothing more than a polite nod. He merged onto the busy highway, and I turned my gaze to the window, staring blankly out at the world passing by. The amber streetlights flickered rapidly across the glass, casting long, shifting shadows over the leather seats and across my face. As the car sped toward the towering downtown skyline, my mind raced far faster than the wheels on the pavement. My family thought they had me completely figured out. Vivian and my half-sister Dominique loved nothing more than to spin this pathetic narrative that I was just a lucky girl from the wrong side of the tracks, a desperate woman who somehow managed to trap a wealthy, sophisticated man. In their eyes, I was nothing but a charity case. They saw me as a silent, dutiful housewife who spent her days happily spending Marcus's money and smiling vacantly at his side during high society galas. They had absolutely no idea who I actually was. More importantly, they had no idea who Marcus and I were together. Marcus was a brilliant man with numbers. He possessed a mind that could analyze complex market trends and spot lucrative investments that others completely missed. But he lacked the ruthless cutthroat killer instinct required to survive and thrive in Atlanta's elite financial circles. He had the charm, the intellect, and the pedigree, but I had the strategy. I was not his dependent. I was his architect. I had spent the last 7 years of my life working deep in the shadows as a high-level crisis management consultant. I navigated devastating public relations disasters for prominent politicians, covered up massive corporate scandals, and expertly controlled media narratives for people with far too much money and far too many dark secrets. When Marcus wanted to climb the corporate ladder at the Sterling Investment Group, I was the one who drafted his pitch decks late into the night. I was the one who anticipated the sudden market shifts and fed him the exact talking points that made the board of directors view him as an untouchable visionary. I coached him on precisely what to say and how to behave during his partnership interviews. We were a team in the absolute truest sense of the word. He was the handsome, charismatic face of our success, and I was the unseen brain pulling the strings behind the curtain. We kept my deep involvement completely hidden because in that hyper-competitive alpha male world, a man admitting his wife runs his entire career strategy is a swift death sentence to his ego and his professional standing. I never needed the public credit or the applause. I only ever needed him. And now he was gone, and the vultures in my own family were already circling the remains of our life. The driver pulled up to the pristine curb of Sterling Tower. The building was a massive, imposing monolith of tinted glass and cold steel, completely dominating the downtown Atlanta skyline. It was an absolute fortress of wealth and corporate power, intimidating by design. I paid the driver, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked through the heavy revolving doors. The main lobby was impossibly expansive, lined from floor to ceiling with imported white Italian marble and glowing with harsh modern architectural lighting. The sound of my own footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous space. I approached the massive front reception desk. Behind it stood a young receptionist with perfectly blown-out blonde hair, wearing a tailored navy designer suit that probably cost a full month of her salary. She was typing rapidly on her sleek keyboard. She did not even bother to look up as I approached the counter, her eyes glued to her monitor. "I need access to the penthouse level," I said, my voice steady, clear, and completely devoid of emotion. "Isaiah Sterling is expecting me right now." The receptionist finally stopped typing. She let out a soft, exaggerated sigh and slowly looked up, allowing her gaze to drag from the scuffed toes of my black pumps up the entire length of my wrinkled funeral dress, and finally settling on my bare, exhausted face. I had not slept a single hour in 3 days, and I certainly had not bothered to touch up my makeup after crying over my husband's casket all morning. The judgment in her eyes was immediate, harsh, and utterly transparent. She looked at me and saw a disheveled, grieving black woman who clearly did not belong in this pristine temple of high finance. "I am sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, heavily rehearsed customer service sweetness that is specifically designed to be condescending. "Mr. Sterling is the CEO of this firm. He absolutely does not take unannounced walk-ins from the general public. If you are looking for the charitable donations office that is actually located in the building next door." I placed my hands flat on the cool marble counter and leaned in slightly, refusing to let her dismiss me. "I am not here to ask for a charity donation," I said, my tone hardening. "I am here because the CEO personally summoned me via a secure message exactly 15 minutes ago. My name is Nia. Check your security system." She sighed heavily again, rolling her eyes just a fraction of an inch, as if my mere presence in her lobby was physically exhausting her. She tapped a few quick keys on her computer keyboard, her acrylic nails clicking loudly. "I am looking at Mr. Sterling's private schedule right now, and there is absolutely no Nia listed for today or any other day. I am going to have to ask you to step aside immediately. We have important high net worth clients arriving very soon, and you are currently blocking the executive reception area. If you refuse to leave the premises right now, I will be forced to call security to escort you out." A hot flash of pure adrenaline spiked through my veins, replacing the heavy numbness of my grief. After the profound humiliation I had just endured from my own sister and brother-in-law at the church, I had absolutely zero patience left for a receptionist playing gatekeeper. The crisis manager inside me woke up completely cold and calculating. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene or give her the satisfaction of acting erratic. I simply leaned closer over the desk, closing the physical distance between us until she was forced to look directly into my eyes or retreat. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that made her blink in surprise. "I know exactly how the security in this building operates. I know that your system uses a dual authentication bypass protocol for extreme executive emergencies. Type in authorization code Sigma Hotel 904. The receptionist stared at me, her smug, condescending expression instantly faltering. "How do you know an internal executive security code?" she asked, her voice losing its fake sweetness. "Type it in right now," I commanded, never breaking eye contact. She swallowed hard, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she nervously typed the sequence into her terminal. The computer immediately chimed with a loud, crisp, affirmative ping that echoed in the quiet lobby. The heavy glass security turnstiles across the room suddenly flashed a bright green, and the doors to the private VIP elevator slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. The receptionist stared at her screen in absolute, unadulterated shock. The authorization name flashing on her monitor was not mine. It was a master override code that Marcus had secretly shared with me years ago for absolute life-or-death emergencies. "You are cleared to go up to the penthouse," she stammered, her face completely draining of color as she realized she had just threatened to throw out someone with top-tier executive clearance. "I am so sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am." I did not offer her a smile, a nod, or a single word of forgiveness. I simply turned on my heel and walked straight through the green turnstiles with my head held high. The thick glass doors of the VIP elevator closed silently behind me, completely shutting out the lobby and the stunned receptionist. The elevator shot upward, with dizzying, terrifying speed, climbing higher and higher above the city streets. My stomach dropped with the sudden altitude, but my mind was laser-focused. Isaiah Sterling did not send cryptic text messages unless the situation was catastrophic. He was a man who literally moved global markets with a single phone call. If he was telling me to hide my movements from my own family, it meant the eviction notice Brad had just shoved in my face was only the very tip of a deeply dark, very dangerous iceberg. The elevator chimed a soft bell indicating I had reached the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal a massive sprawling corner office surrounded entirely by floor-to-ceiling windows. The late afternoon sun poured heavily into the room, casting long golden shadows across the dark polished oak floors. Isaiah Sterling stood by the window looking out over the city holding a heavy crystal glass of amber bourbon. He was a formidable, intimidating presence, a self-made billionaire who carried the massive weight of his empire with a terrifying, effortless grace. He turned slowly as I stepped into the room, his expression grave and deeply troubled. "Nia," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that filled the large room. "I am so deeply sorry about Marcus. He was the absolute best man I had in this entire firm." "Thank you, Isaiah," I replied, clutching the strap of my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You sent me a message saying I was in danger. You explicitly told me not to tell my family I was coming here. What is going on?" "What?" Isaiah did not answer me immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his bourbon and stepped aside, revealing the rest of the expansive office. Sitting in a high-backed leather armchair in the shadowed corner of the room was another man. He stood up slowly as I noticed him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a sharp, unassuming gray suit. He did not look like an investment banker. He did not look like a grieving colleague stopping by to pay his respects. He reached his hand into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, flipping it open with a flick of his wrist to reveal a shining gold shield. "Mrs. Nia," he said, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to have a very serious conversation right now about your husband's unexpected death and the $10 million that just vanished completely from his accounts." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, completely freezing the blood in my veins. $10 million. My mind, usually capable of processing complex scenarios in fractions of a second, stalled. I stared at Agent Miller, analyzing the sharp lines of his face, looking for any sign that this was a cruel, elaborate test orchestrated by Isaiah to gauge my loyalty. But the federal agent's expression remained entirely stony, completely devoid of deception. I turned my gaze to Isaiah. He gave a slow, grim nod, confirming the absolute reality of the nightmare unfolding before me. Marcus did not have $10 million to his name. I stated, my voice echoing coldly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He was brilliant, but he was inherently conservative with his wealth. We lived comfortably, but we did not possess that kind of liquid capital. If $10 million vanished from his accounts, it was not his money. It was not his money, Agent Miller confirmed, taking a step forward and tossing a thick, heavily redacted manila folder onto Isaiah's polished mahogany desk. The money belonged to the Sterling Investment Group. It was pulled from an offshore holding account reserved for high-yield international acquisitions. The transfer was initiated exactly 48 hours before your husband was officially pronounced dead. I moved toward the desk, my hands hovering over the file. My professional instincts completely overrode my profound grief. I opened the folder. Inside were pages of financial routing numbers, encrypted server logs, and digital authorization signatures. I scanned the documents rapidly, my eyes darting across the familiar corporate letterheads. The transfer authorized the movement of the funds through a labyrinth of shell companies, eventually landing in a private corporate entity registered in Delaware. I looked closely at the final destination account. The holding company was named Apex Horizon Capital. I felt a sickening jolt in my stomach. Apex Horizon Capital was the parent company of Brad's private lending firm. Brad took it, I whispered, the puzzle pieces violently slamming into place. The eviction notice at the repast. The smug confidence. He was not trying to collect on a bad mortgage. He was creating a massive legal distraction to seize the physical assets and tie up my legal resources before the federal auditors could notice the missing corporate funds. Agent Miller nodded sharply. Your brother-in-law is currently the primary suspect in a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. But the financial theft is not why I am standing in this office, Mrs. Nia. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not typically handle straightforward corporate theft of this scale without the SEC. We are here because of how the transfer was executed. Agent Miller reached into the folder and pulled out a secondary file, this one marked with the logo of the hospital where Marcus had died. He placed a stark white sheet of paper on top of the financial records. It was a toxicology report. "Your husband did not die from a spontaneous brain aneurysm," Agent Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the grim weight of a coroner delivering a verdict. The initial hospital records were completely falsified. The doctors who pronounced him dead were operating on swapped medical charts. We intercepted the actual blood work from the independent lab this morning. Marcus had lethal, highly concentrated doses of a synthetic coagulant in his system. It was specifically designed to mimic the exact symptoms of a massive aneurysm. It is undetectable unless you are specifically looking for it. I stopped breathing. The massive penthouse office around me seemed to physically shrink, the walls closing in rapidly. They murdered him. The realization did not come as a wave of sadness. It came as a strike of pure blinding lightning. My husband, my safe haven, the only man who ever truly saw me, was assassinated. While Marcus was in his medically induced coma, fighting for his life in the intensive care unit, the funds were transferred. Agent Miller continued ruthlessly laying out the facts. We pulled the hospital security footage. Your stepmother, Vivian, utilized her familial status to bypass the standard visitor restrictions. She accessed his private recovery room. We have undeniable proof that she used Marcus's biometric thumbprint while he was unconscious to unlock his encrypted mobile device and authorize the dual-factor authentication required to release the $10 million to Brad's shell company. Vivian provided the access. Brad provided the financial infrastructure. They killed him to steal from this firm, and they planned to leave you completely destitute to cover their tracks. The image of Vivian standing at the funeral, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes for the cameras, flashed in my mind. The memory of Brad shoving that eviction notice into my chest while I clutched my husband's funeral program made my vision completely blur with a rage so profound it transcended human emotion. They had destroyed my entire world, murdered the love of my life, and then had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to try and throw me out onto the street. We have enough physical evidence to secure a grand jury indictment today, Agent Miller stated, adjusting his suit jacket. I have tactical SWAT teams standing by at the regional field office. We are prepared to raid Brad's corporate headquarters and Vivian's private estate simultaneously tonight. We will arrest them, seize their assets, and freeze every single bank account associated with their names. We are bringing them down, Mrs. Nia. I just need you to step aside and let the Bureau do its job. He reached out, preparing to gather the files and initiate the arrests. Do not touch those papers, I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp edge that made Agent Miller freeze instantly. The atmosphere in the massive room shifted entirely. I stepped closer to the glass table. The camera of my own mind seemed to physically zoom in, pushing past the periphery of the vast office, focusing solely on the reflection of my own eyes in the window pane. The exhausted, grieving widow was completely dead. The ruthless crisis manager had taken full control. Agent Miller looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion and rising irritation. Mrs. Nia, I understand you are in shock, but this is an active federal homicide and embezzlement investigation. We are moving in tonight. If you arrest Brad tonight, you will lose the entire war, I said, my tone absolute and unyielding. You do not understand the elite social ecosystem of this city, Agent Miller. Brad comes from legacy trust fund money. If you send a tactical team to his office, his family's high-powered defense attorneys will have him out on bail before the sun comes up tomorrow. They will immediately file injunctions to suppress the hospital security footage. Vivian will go straight to the local media. She will cry on camera claiming that I am the bitter, jealous daughter from the wrong side of the tracks who manipulated federal agents into framing her to steal her family's wealth. They will spin the narrative flawlessly. They will use their massive social influence to paint me as the mastermind, and they will drag Marcus's pristine reputation through the absolute mud to create reasonable doubt for a jury. Agent Miller scowled, crossing his arms over his chest. We deal with high-priced lawyers every single day. The evidence is completely solid. Evidence does not win cases against billionaires in Atlanta. I shot back, my voice dripping with absolute certainty. Public perception dictates reality. You arrest them now and they become wealthy martyrs persecuted by the government. They will drag this trial out for a decade, bleeding the prosecution dry, until you are forced to offer them a quiet, comfortable plea deal. I will not allow that to happen. I will not allow the people who murdered my husband to spend a single day fighting this from the comfort of their luxury mansions. Isaiah Sterling finally stepped forward from the shadows, leaving his bourbon glass on a side table. He looked at the federal agent, then turned his intense, calculating gaze toward me. He knew exactly what I was capable of. He had seen me obliterate the careers of untouchable politicians without ever leaving a fingerprint. "What is your alternative, Nia?" Isaiah asked, his voice low and expectant. I looked directly at Agent Miller, then shifted my burning gaze to Isaiah. Arresting him now is too easy. A quiet federal indictment gives them dignity. It gives them a chance to fight behind closed doors. They love their high society status and their stolen money more than they love oxygen. I will not just send them to prison. I am going to strip them of both their wealth and their status right in front of the entire world. I will force them to confess their crimes and turn on each other on live television. Isaiah Sterling held my gaze for a long, silent moment. The corners of his mouth slowly curled upward into a chilling, predatory smile. He reached behind his desk, picked up a thick, unmarked black folder, and pushed it across the smooth wood directly toward me. I pulled the heavy black folder toward me, my fingers gliding over the smooth, unmarked leather. Inside lay a masterclass in corporate espionage and digital warfare. There were untraceable microtransmitters, encrypted flash drives, loaded with malware designed to bypass standard corporate firewalls, and security override tokens that could unlock the most heavily guarded physical servers in the city. Isaiah Sterling knew exactly how I operated. He knew I did not fight with loud accusations or messy public outbursts. I fought with precision, gathering undeniable leverage until the trap was perfectly sprung. I closed the folder, slipping it seamlessly into my large designer tote. When I stood up from the glass table, I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my spine to curve, letting the fierce, calculating fire in my eyes completely extinguish. I practiced the physical manifestation of defeat. I was no longer the ruthless crisis manager orchestrating the destruction of billionaires. I was once again the shattered, destitute widow, broken by grief and terrified of the future. I thanked Isaiah and Agent Miller in a soft, wavering voice, assuring the federal agent that my methods would yield a much more permanent and devastating justice than a simple midnight raid. The ride back to my home in the suburbs was agonizingly slow. By the time the rideshare pulled into my long, sweeping driveway, the reality of my new existence was parked directly in front of my garage. Vivian's silver luxury sedan and Dominique's sleek imported sports car were angled carelessly across the pavement. They had wasted absolutely no time invading the sanctuary Marcus and I had built. I stepped out of the vehicle, clutching my purse tightly against my chest, and walked toward the front door with my head bowed. I kept my breathing shallow, holding on to the fragile, terrified persona I needed them to believe. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the foyer. The house, usually a place of profound quiet and warmth, had been completely hijacked. The sharp sound of clinking crystal and the piercing, barking laughter of my stepmother echoed down the hallway from the main living room. I walked slowly toward the noise, letting my footsteps drag heavily against the hardwood floor. Vivian was lounging on my custom velvet sofa, holding a glass of expensive champagne, completely ignoring the fact that she was resting her feet on the delicate antique coffee table Marcus had bought for our anniversary. Dominique stood by the grand stone fireplace, flipping through a massive stack of high-end catering brochures and floral arrangement catalogs. They stopped talking the absolute second I entered the room. Vivian looked me up and down, her lips instantly curling into a familiar sneer of unfiltered disgust. She looked at my wrinkled funeral dress and my exhausted makeup-free face, clearly reveling in my perceived misery. "What are you doing here?" Vivian asked, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. "Brad told you that you had 30 days to vacate this property, but honestly, we expected you to have the dignity to pack your cheap bags and leave tonight." I played my part flawlessly. I let my lower lip tremble, wrapping my arms around my stomach as if trying to hold myself together. I have nowhere else to go right now, I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Please, Vivian, I just need a few days to figure things out. Marcus just died. Dominique let out a short, mocking laugh, tossing a catering brochure onto the table. Marcus is gone, Nia. And with him goes your free ride. But since you are currently taking up space in Brad's new property, you might as well make yourself useful. Dominique took a sip of her champagne and proudly announced their grand plan. They were hosting a massive event right here in the house by the end of the week. They were calling it the Marcus Memorial Charity Gala. She boasted that every wealthy investor, socialite, and politician in Atlanta would be in attendance to honor my late husband. But as she explained the details, my mind instantly connected the dark, sickening dots. They were using a memorial gala named after the man they murdered as a front to solicit massive amounts of clean startup investment capital. Brad was going to mix the donations from Atlanta's elite directly with the $10 million he had stolen, laundering the blood money through a legitimate public event. It was brilliantly ruthless. Since you are living on borrowed time under our roof, you are going to earn your keep, Vivian commanded, setting her empty glass down with a sharp clink. Brad needs Marcus's home office cleared out immediately. He is taking very important calls tonight regarding the gala's VIP investors, and he refuses to work in a room cluttered with your husband's leftover garbage. Vivian reached behind the sofa, produced a large black trash bag, and threw it directly at my feet. The plastic landed with a dull thud against the hardwood. Pack up his things, she ordered, and sweep the floors while you are at it. We cannot have the investors seeing a speck of dust when they arrive for the walkthroughs tomorrow. Do not come out until the room is spotless. I stared down at the trash bag, forcing tears to well up in my eyes. I offered a weak, utterly defeated nod, bending down to pick up the plastic bag with trembling hands. Dominique smirked, turning her back on me to pour herself another glass of champagne, thoroughly enjoying the sight of me reduced to a domestic servant in my own home. I turned and walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward Marcus's study. The moment I crossed the threshold and the heavy oak door clicked firmly shut behind me, the trembling in my hands vanished completely. I dropped the trash bag onto the floor. I rolled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and stood at my full height. The broken widow disappeared. My posture corrected itself, radiating cold, calculated authority. I moved swiftly and silently across the room. The study felt violated. Brad's expensive leather briefcase was sitting right in the center of Marcus's desk, an absolute desecration of my husband's private space. I opened my tote bag and retrieved two of the microscopic audio transmitters from Isaiah's black folder. They were no larger than a grain of rice, equipped with advanced military-grade batteries and encrypted cellular uplinks. I approached the heavy mahogany desk. Running my fingers along the underside, I found a small natural groove in the wood, perfectly out of sight. I wedged the first transmitter deep beneath the lip of the desk, perfectly concealed within the dark wood grain where Brad would be sitting. I moved toward the massive, intricate bookshelf directly behind the leather desk chair and planted the second device inside the hollowed-out base of a decorative bronze globe. The room was now fully wired, transmitting a crystal-clear audio feed directly to a secure cloud server I controlled. I quickly grabbed a dusting cloth from a nearby cabinet and began furiously wiping down the lower shelves, dropping to my knees and playing the part of the obedient broken maid just as the heavy oak door violently swung open. Brad marched into the study, completely ignoring my presence on the floor, as if I were nothing more than a discarded piece of furniture. He had a cell phone pressed tightly to his ear, his face flushed with arrogant excitement. He pointed a sharp finger at the door, silently ordering me to get out of his sight. I deliberately dropped the dusting cloth behind the sofa, crawling further into the shadows to retrieve it, making myself physically invisible and buying myself crucial, precious seconds. Brad sank into Marcus's leather chair, kicking his expensive shoes up onto the desk. He began speaking rapidly into the phone, his voice dripping with pure, unfiltered greed. Yes, the initial $10 million injection is completely secure, Brad said, laughing softly into the receiver. The hospital handled the medical complications perfectly. No one suspects a thing. The widow is completely clueless. She is currently sweeping my floors. I held my breath in the shadows, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. I memorized every single syllable, every inflection of his voice. The funds are sitting safely in the Delaware shell accounts. Brad continued, lowering his voice slightly. And the charity gala this weekend will wrap the entire capital transfer in a neat, untouchable public relations bow. The money will be completely clean by Monday morning. I am ready to finalize the transfer of the corporate shares whenever your board is ready to sign the paperwork. Brad paused, listening intently to the person on the other end of the line. A massive, triumphant smile spread across his face, exposing his teeth. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Perfect, Brad said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet study. I will have the final contracts overnighted to your legal team immediately. I am thrilled to be doing business with you, gentlemen. We are going to make a fortune together. Thank you for your trust in me, and please give my best regards to the entire board at Apex Holdings. I stayed frozen behind the sofa, the plush velvet pressing against my spine as a cold, triumphant smile mirrored the one Brad wore, though mine was born of an entirely different breed of satisfaction. Apex Holdings. He had absolutely no idea. The name rolled off his tongue with such unearned reverence, a man completely blinded by his own towering hubris. He thought he was negotiating with a syndicate of elite faceless Wall Street titans. He thought he was playing in the major leagues. He did not know he was actually negotiating with a ghost. Apex Holdings did not exist 48 hours ago. It was a digital phantom, a hollow corporate shell manufactured in the dead of night by Isaiah Sterling and myself. While my family was busy picking out their funeral attire and plotting my financial ruin, Isaiah and I had sat in his penthouse office, drafting the corporate architecture of their absolute destruction. Apex Holdings was a trap specifically designed to exploit the very core of Brad's character. He was a man born on third base who spent his entire life loudly demanding credit for hitting a triple. His arrogance was his ultimate vulnerability. I waited until I heard the heavy squeak of the leather chair, followed by the solid click of his expensive Italian loafers striding across the hardwood floor. The heavy oak door opened and shut. I remained completely motionless for another full 60 seconds, letting the silence settle over the room. Moving with the calculated precision of a shadow, I crawled out from behind the sofa. I retrieved my dusting cloth, smoothed out my wrinkled dress, and slipped out of the study, my heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm of war. I retreated to the tiny, cramped guest bedroom at the far end of the hallway, the only space Vivian had allowed me to occupy. I locked the door silently. I reached beneath the mattress and pulled out the encrypted mobile device Isaiah had provided. The screen glowed harshly in the dim light. It was time to tighten the noose. Operating under the heavily shielded alias of the Apex Holdings lead acquisition director, I drafted a rapid, aggressive email directly to Brad's private server. I did not offer him praise or excitement. I offered him cold, hard corporate leverage. I informed him that our risk assessment committee was experiencing sudden, severe reservations regarding the liquidity of his startup capital. I demanded an immediate restructuring of the merger agreement, aggressively slashing his projected profit margins and imposing ruthless oversight conditions. It was a deliberate insult to his ego. I knew exactly how a man like Brad would react to being squeezed by a larger predator. He would not back down or review the fine print. He would aggressively push forward to prove his dominance. I hit send and waited. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard his voice echoing down the corridor. He was shouting into his phone, storming out of the master suite. I cracked my door open just a fraction of an inch, peering through the narrow sliver of light. Brad was pacing furiously, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He was arguing with his own legal counsel on speakerphone, completely dismissing their frantic advice to slow down. He is a typical legacy-bred aristocrat, I thought, watching him wave his hands wildly. He possesses the unearned confidence of a man who has never once been told no, a man who firmly believes his privilege makes him invincible. He was so desperate to secure the laundered funds, so desperate to solidify his status as a financial heavyweight, that he was entirely willing to throw caution to the wind. He yelled at his attorney to accept the revised terms immediately, demanding that the paperwork be finalized before the memorial gala began. He wanted to parade that signed contract around the ballroom like a trophy. I closed the door, silently pressing my back against the cool wood. The bait had been taken. The poison pill was now firmly embedded in the contract. Buried deep within the 70 pages of dense, convoluted legal jargon I had drafted with Isaiah's team was a specific, non-negotiable indemnity clause. It was explicitly designed for this exact scenario. The clause stated that in the event of any discovered financial fraud, embezzlement, or illicit laundering connected to the initial startup capital, the signatory would be held personally liable for 10 times the total investment amount. By signing that document, Brad was not just surrendering his stolen $10 million. He was legally binding himself to a $100 million penalty. He was signing away his family's generational wealth, his estates, his offshore accounts, and his entire future. And he was doing it with a smile on his face, convinced he was outsmarting the world. The next 3 days were a grueling exercise in psychological endurance. Vivian and Dominique treated me with escalating cruelty, completely buying into my facade of the broken, destitute widow. I was ordered to scrub the grand staircase on my hands and knees. I polished the crystal chandeliers until my fingers bled. I arranged massive, ostentatious floral centerpieces, while Dominique stood over me sipping sparkling water and criticizing my technique. I swallowed every insult. I absorbed every mocking laugh. I let them treat me like dirt because I knew I was currently polishing the very floor where they would soon be financially slaughtered. The evening of the gala arrived with a suffocating wave of expensive perfume-tailored tuxedos and fake sympathy. The house was transformed into a sickening monument to Marcus, funded by the very people who had murdered him. The elite of Atlanta poured through the front doors, handing over massive donation checks to Brad, completely unaware they were funding a criminal enterprise. I was forced to stand by the coat check tasked with taking the jackets of the wealthy guests. I kept my head down, my expression blank, playing the tragic background character perfectly. But my eyes were constantly moving, tracking Brad as he worked the room. He was in his element, shaking hands, clapping politicians on the back, and laughing loudly. Midway through the evening, I saw him receive a notification on his phone. He practically sprinted to his study, followed closely by 2 of his primary investors. I knew exactly what was happening. The final digital contracts from Apex Holdings had arrived. I slipped away from the coat check, moving silently down the back servants' corridor. I pulled out my encrypted phone, accessing the live audio feed from the transmitters I had planted in his study. Brad's voice came through crisp and clear. "Gentlemen, the future of our enterprise is now fully secured," he announced, the sound of a popping champagne cork echoing through the feed. "I just signed the final merger agreement with Apex Holdings. The capital is locked. We are officially untouchable." A cold, sharp thrill surged through my veins. He signed it. The trap had officially snapped shut. He had just legally authorized his own absolute destruction. The $100 million guillotine was now hanging directly over his neck, waiting for my command to drop. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to return to the gala to witness the beginning of the end. But as I turned the corner to head back to the main hall, a hand violently grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around with brutal force. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall hard. Dominique stood in front of me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of triumphant malice and aggressive suspicion. She was holding a small, intricate brass key. It was not a house key. It was a high-security safe deposit box key from the First National Bank of Atlanta. It was my key. I had hidden it inside the lining of my only remaining suitcase, wrapped securely in a pair of wool socks. It was the key to the physical evidence I had gathered over the years, the contingency files Marcus and I had compiled, just in case a day like this ever arrived. Dominique held the brass key up, dangling it in front of my face like a twisted prize. Her designer gown glittered in the dim light of the hallway, but her expression was entirely ugly. "I caught you, you deceitful little rat," Dominique sneered, stepping closer, invading my personal space. I saw you sneaking around the back hallways instead of working the coat check like you were told. So I decided to do a little sweeping of my own in your pathetic excuse for a room. My mind raced, calculating a dozen different responses, but I maintained my mask of terrified submission. I tried to reach for the key, my hands trembling genuinely now, though not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the sudden complication. "Please, Dominique," I stammered, making my voice sound weak and panicked. "Give that back to me. It is just an old key from a storage unit. It means nothing. Do not play me for a fool." "Nia," she snapped, her voice rising to a dangerous pitch. "I know a First National Bank key when I see one. Brad banks there. I know exactly what these look like. You are supposed to be completely broke. You are supposed to have absolutely nothing left. So why does the penniless widow have a high-security safe deposit box at the most exclusive financial institution in the city?" I lowered my gaze, biting the inside of my cheek to keep my composure. "I need that back," I repeated softly. "You are going to tell me exactly what is in that box," Dominique demanded, grabbing my arm and squeezing it hard enough to bruise. "And you are not going to lie to me. In fact, we are not going to talk about it here. You are going to put your coat on right now. We are leaving this party through the back door, and we are driving straight to that bank. You are going to open that box for me tonight, or I swear to God, Nia, I will drag Brad away from his investors and have him throw you out onto the street without a single cent to your name. Move." I stared at the brass key dangling from her manicured fingers, forcing my breathing to become rapid and shallow. I let my shoulders tremble, a pathetic, cornered animal trapped under the blinding lights of her hostility. "Dominique, please?" I begged, my voice cracking with perfectly manufactured desperation. "The bank vaults are on a strict time lock. It is 10 o'clock at night. The physical security grid at First National shuts down at 6. We cannot get past the lobby doors, let alone down into the subterranean vault level. If we leave now, Brad will notice you are missing, and Vivian will be furious that we caused a scene." Dominique paused, her eyes narrowing as she processed the logistical reality of my words. Her grip on my arm loosened slightly, though her glare remained venomous. She hated to admit when someone else was right, especially me. "I will take you tomorrow morning," I whispered, keeping my gaze submissively locked onto the floorboards. "First thing. I promise. I will sign over whatever is in the box. Just do not tell Brad. Please, let me stay." Dominique snatched her hand away violently, shoving me back against the wall. She slipped the brass key into her designer clutch with a triumphant, malicious smile. She believed she possessed the ultimate leverage, entirely unaware that the key merely opened a box containing legal documents that would eventually send her entire family to federal prison. "Tomorrow morning," Dominique hissed, pointing a sharp acrylic nail at my face. "But right now, we have a bigger problem. The grand finale of this ridiculous memorial charity event is tomorrow night, and Vivian refuses to let you walk around the ballroom looking like a homeless vagrant. We are going to Buckhead tomorrow afternoon. You are going to carry our bags, and we will find something suitable to cover up your tragic aesthetic." I nodded meekly, keeping my hands clasped tightly in front of me, until she finally turned on her heel and strutted back toward the noise of the gala. The moment she disappeared around the corner, my terrified expression vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. The distraction had worked flawlessly. The following afternoon, the thick, humid Atlanta heat was entirely blocked out by the aggressive air conditioning of the most exclusive luxury bridal and evening wear boutique in the heart of Buckhead. The store was a sprawling, pristine sanctuary of white marble crystal chandeliers and racks of imported silk that cost more than a luxury vehicle. I sat rigidly on a plush, curved velvet sofa in the center of the VIP viewing area. I held a crystal glass of complimentary sparkling water, my fingers slowly tracing the rim. If there had been a camera circling me, it would have captured the stark contrast between my drab, exhausted exterior and the deeply sarcastic, ruthless fire burning just behind my eyes. Vivian and Dominique were holding court in front of the massive trifold mirrors, surrounded by 3 fawning, hyper-attentive sales associates. The staff members were dressed in immaculate black uniforms, hovering like desperate vultures, offering endless streams of fake compliments, as my stepmother and half-sister modeled gowns that cost tens of thousands of dollars. I remained perfectly silent on the sofa, absorbing the entire spectacle. I watched the sales associates throw subtle, judgmental glances in my direction. They looked at my scuffed shoes and my plain, unbranded clothing with poorly concealed disgust. In their shallow, commission-driven world, I was a peasant polluting their pristine environment. Absolutely breathtaking. Mrs. Sterling, the lead associate, gushed, adjusting the train of a heavily beaded crimson gown Vivian was wearing. The beadwork highlights your complexion perfectly. It screams absolute power. Vivian smirked at her reflection, adjusting a diamond necklace. It is adequate. Wrap it up. And the emerald silk for my daughter. Dominique stepped out of her fitting room, tossing a discarded gown onto a nearby chair for an associate to catch. She turned her arrogant gaze toward me, her eyes sweeping over my seated form with unfiltered malice. She walked over to a clearance rack hidden near the back of the boutique, a section reserved for outdated, heavily discounted inventory. She pulled out a drab, shapeless gray dress made of cheap, stiff synthetic fabric. It was the color of dirty concrete, utterly devoid of style or elegance. Dominique marched back to the VIP area and threw the dress directly at my face. The heavy plastic hanger struck my collarbone as the ugly fabric draped over my lap. "Wear this!" Dominique ordered, her voice loud enough to ensure every single person in the boutique was listening. Do not let your impoverished, pathetic look pollute the eyes of Brad's investors tonight. You are already a stain on this family's reputation. The least you can do is blend into the wallpaper. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Then the lead sales associate let out a sharp, mocking snicker. The other two associates quickly joined in, covering their mouths to hide their cruel, condescending laughter. They looked at me with pure pity mixed with amusement, completely eager to align themselves with the wealthy clients holding the platinum credit cards. "I believe that shade of gray is incredibly fitting for her," Miss the lead associate chimed in, her tone dripping with venomous customer service sweetness. "It perfectly matches her energy. Would you like me to find a belt to give it at least a fraction of a silhouette, or should we leave it as a sack?" Dominique laughed loudly, high-fiving the associate. "Leave it as a sack, it suits her perfectly." I did not react. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flush with embarrassment or rise to their pathetic bait. I simply picked up the ugly gray dress, stood up from the velvet sofa, and offered a blank, subservient nod. "Thank you, Dominique," I whispered softly. I turned and walked quietly toward the row of expansive private fitting rooms at the back of the boutique. The sound of their mocking laughter echoed off the marble walls, following me all the way down the corridor. I stepped into the massive mirrored fitting room and closed the heavy wooden door, sliding the solid brass lock into place. The instant the lock clicked, my subservient posture vanished. The heavy gray dress slipped from my fingers, landing in a discarded heap on the floor. I pulled out my encrypted mobile device from my pocket, bypassing the security protocols with a swift sequence of biometric scans. I dialed a private, unlisted offshore number. It rang exactly twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Apex Holdings Legal Division, go ahead." "This is the architect," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. "I need you to initiate an aggressive, immediate, hostile takeover of the Buckhead Bridal and Evening Boutique. I want the holding company purchased and all assets transferred to our dummy corporation by the end of the business day. Price is not an object. Pay double the market valuation if you have to, but get it done now." "Understood," the voice replied smoothly. "And the existing staff?" "The moment the ink dries on the acquisition papers, you are to terminate the entire management and sales staff," I commanded, my eyes meeting my own cold reflection in the mirror. "Fire every single one of them. Effective immediately. Ensure they are given exactly 5 minutes to clear out their lockers and strip them of all severance packages due to hostile acquisition restructuring. I want them out on the street tomorrow morning. Consider it done." I ended the call, slipping the phone back into my pocket. A profound, icy satisfaction settled over me. They wanted to treat me like garbage in front of the world. Tomorrow they would wake up completely unemployed, blacklisted from the luxury retail market. I bent down to retrieve the gray dress, preparing to put on the literal uniform of my subjugation, when a sudden, urgent voice filtered through the thin air vent connecting the fitting rooms to the private back office hallway. I froze, my hand hovering over the fabric. I recognized the arrogant, impatient cadence instantly. It was Brad. I pressed my ear completely flat against the cool metal of the air vent, holding my breath. "I do not care what the legal team says," Vivian Brad hissed, his voice muffled but entirely recognizable. "I need this handled right now. The investors are practically throwing money at us, but the timeline is moving too fast. We need to tie up the loose ends before the federal regulators start sniffing around Marcus's sudden exit." "Keep your voice down," Vivian snapped back, her tone sharp and filled with anxiety. "I handled the hospital, the doctor has been paid off, and the original files are incinerated. You just need to focus on securing the Apex Holdings capital tonight." "I am focusing on the capital," Brad growled. "But Dominique is getting paranoid. She is asking too many questions about the timeline." "Tell me the truth right now, Vivian. Are the DNA test results for the baby back yet?" I held my breath, pressing my ear so tightly against the cold metal grating of the air vent that the sharp ridges dug painfully into my skin. The sheer depravity of the question hung in the stagnant air of the hidden corridor. "Keep your voice down," Vivian hissed, her tone venomous and sharp. "Yes, the private clinic sent the secure file this morning. You are the father. Now you need to back off and stay entirely away from her. If Harrison finds out the child Dominique is carrying belongs to her own brother-in-law, the wedding is completely off. The Harrison family is deeply conservative and they will not tolerate a scandal of this magnitude." I could practically hear Brad's arrogant smirk through the thin walls. "Harrison is an absolute idiot," Brad scoffed, his voice laced with supreme overconfidence. "His family holds a net worth of over $400 million. Once that ring is permanently on her finger and the baby is born, we hold the ultimate leverage. We wait a year and then we threaten to expose the paternity scandal to the global press. His parents will quietly transfer tens of millions into our offshore accounts just to make the nightmare go away. It is an airtight insurance policy." "Do not get greedy and ruin this before the ink is dry," Vivian commanded flatly. "You focus on securing the Apex Holdings capital tonight at the gala. Leave Dominique and the blackmail strategy to me." The heavy door of the back office clicked shut, leaving me alone with the sickening echo of their conversation. The moral rot of my family was absolute, a bottomless pit of greed and betrayal. They were not just thieves and murderers. They were orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar extortion ring using an unborn child as leverage. The layers of their deception were staggering, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, my mind crystallized into a state of absolute diamond-hard clarity. I knew every single one of their secrets. I held the detonator to their entire world. I picked up the shapeless gray dress from the floor, slipped it over my head, and stepped out of the fitting room with my shoulders slumped. Dominique and Vivian did not even bother to look in my direction as I trailed behind them out of the boutique, carrying their heavy designer garment bags like a dutiful, broken servant. By the time we returned to the estate, the sun had set, casting long, imposing shadows across the manicured lawns. The caterers were already setting up for the gala, transforming the property into a shallow, hypocritical shrine to my dead husband. I was directed to wait in the formal living room. When I entered, the atmosphere was thick with manufactured solemnity. Vivian was seated by the grand fireplace, her posture rigidly elegant. Brad stood near the mantel, swirling a glass of scotch. Dominique lounged on an armchair, scrolling through her phone. Sitting directly across from them was Arthur Vance, a high-powered, morally bankrupt estate lawyer who had been on Vivian's private payroll for over a decade. He held a sleek leather briefcase on his lap. "Have a seat," Vivian ordered, gesturing vaguely to a rigid wooden chair positioned in the center of the room, isolating me completely from the rest of the group. "Arthur has brought us some incredibly sensitive documentation that requires your immediate attention." I sat down, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap, projecting the image of a terrified, defenseless widow. Arthur adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and pulled a sealed cream envelope from his briefcase. "Mrs. Sterling," Arthur began, his voice dripping with rehearsed legal sympathy. "While auditing Marcus's private corporate files this morning, we discovered a sealed codicil. A supplementary addition to his primary, will drafted and notarized exactly 2 weeks before his unfortunate passing. Marcus and I shared the same legal counsel, I said softly, injecting a slight tremor into my voice. Isaiah Sterling handles all of our estate planning. Marcus would never use an outside firm. Clearly, he felt the need for absolute discretion in this particular matter, Arthur replied smoothly, breaking the heavy wax seal on the envelope. He pulled out a crisp single-page document and laid it flat on the mahogany coffee table. I suggest you brace yourself, Nia. The contents are highly distressing. Arthur began to read the document aloud, and with every single word that left his mouth, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet to absolute zero. The document claimed that Marcus had been engaged in a long-standing, deeply secretive, illicit affair with my half-sister Dominique. It stated that Marcus fully believed he was the biological father of the child she was currently carrying. Furthermore, to avoid public scandal and ensure the financial security of his supposed unborn heir, the fake codicil legally stripped me of my status as his primary beneficiary. It completely revoked my rights to our home, our remaining liquid assets, and his corporate pension, transferring every single cent of his remaining estate directly into a blind trust controlled entirely by Vivian and Dominique. The silence that followed the reading was deafening. I stared at the piece of paper resting on the table. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their plan washed over me in a suffocating wave. The financial theft was one thing, the murder was an atrocity, but this was the ultimate sin. They were assassinating Marcus's character. They were painting my brilliant, fiercely loyal husband as a predator who slept with his wife's half-sister, dragging his pristine legacy through the absolute mud just to legitimize their theft and cover up Brad's incestuous indiscretion. If the world believed Marcus was the father, the Harrison family would never suspect Brad, and Vivian's sick blackmail scheme would remain perfectly intact. Tears of genuine, unadulterated fury burned the back of my eyes. My muscles coiled tight as steel cables. The submissive mask I had worn all day began to violently crack. I looked at Dominique, who was staring back at me with a look of pure, triumphant malice. I looked at Brad, hiding a smirk behind his crystal glass of scotch. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to cross the room, wrap my hands around Dominique's throat, and squeeze until that smug, arrogant look was permanently erased from her face. I wanted to tear the entire room apart and burn the house to the ground with all of them locked inside. The adrenaline spiked so hard my vision literally tinted red. I shifted my weight forward, my hands gripping the armrests of the wooden chair, preparing to launch myself across the coffee table. Right at that exact second, a sharp, singular vibration pulsed against my thigh. My phone had buzzed in my pocket. The sudden physical sensation snapped my rational mind back into control. I froze. I forced myself to take a shallow, shuddering breath, masking my lethal hesitation as a physical manifestation of overwhelming grief. I slowly released my white-knuckled grip on the armrests and reached into my pocket, acting as though I were reaching for a tissue. I pulled the device out just far enough to glance at the illuminated screen, keeping it angled completely away from Arthur and my family. It was a secure, encrypted text message from Agent Miller at the FBI. I read the short, glowing sentence. "Restrain yourself. Sign the document. It is the final piece of physical evidence we need for a federal forgery and extortion conviction. Let them hang themselves." I stared at the glowing letters, the federal agent's words acting as a bucket of ice water over the raging fire in my chest. Agent Miller was right. If I attacked them now, I was just a hysterical, violent widow. But if I signed that document, I was willingly handing the FBI the murder weapon. They were presenting a forged legal document across state lines to execute a multi-million-dollar fraud. It was the absolute final nail in their collective coffin. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked up at Arthur Vance, then turned my gaze to Vivian and Dominique. I let a single heavy tear fall down my cheek, playing the role of the utterly defeated victim one last time. "Where do I sign?" I whispered, my voice completely hollow. Arthur smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye, and slid a heavy gold fountain pen across the mahogany table toward me. I reached out, letting my trembling fingers wrap around the cold, heavy metal barrel of the fountain pen. The polished gold felt entirely alien against my skin. I kept my chin tucked down toward my chest, allowing my unkempt hair to fall forward and partially obscure my face. I needed them to see a shattered woman, a wife thoroughly defeated by the unimaginable betrayal of her dead husband. I drew in a ragged, shallow breath, forcing my shoulders to heave as a single perfectly timed tear slipped down my cheek and splashed onto the thick legal parchment. "You cannot do this," I whispered, my voice completely fractured and weak. "Marcus loved me. He was loyal to me. This document is a lie. You all know it is a lie." Vivian slammed her perfectly manicured hand onto the coffee table, the sharp, sudden crack echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "Sign the paper, Nia." She snapped, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "Stop embarrassing yourself with this pathetic display." Marcus realized his massive mistake at the very end of his life. He wanted his true bloodline protected, not squandered on a street-level gold digger. "You are incredibly lucky we are letting you walk out of this house with the clothes on your back." I pressed the sharp nib of the pen against the paper. I dragged the dark ink across the signature line, purposefully making my handwriting jagged, frantic, and messy, simulating a state of absolute psychological distress. I signed the forged codicil. I flipped the page, my hands shaking violently, and signed the asset transfer authorizations. I signed away the Victorian estate. I signed away the joint investment accounts. I signed away the corporate pension and the life insurance policies. With every agonizing stroke of the pen, I was legally binding their forgery. I was handing the federal government the exact, undeniable physical proof required to lock every single person in this room away for decades. Arthur Vance snatched the documents the exact second my pen lifted from the final page. He swiftly inspected the signatures, a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. He carefully organized the papers, slid them back into his leather briefcase, and snapped the brass locks shut. He excused himself quickly, offering Vivian a respectful nod, clearly eager to retreat to his office and process his fraudulent, exorbitant billable hours. The moment the heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind the corrupt lawyer, the stifling formal atmosphere of the living room instantly shattered. Brad let out a loud barking laugh that bounced aggressively off the high ceilings. He marched directly to the antique globe bar cart situated in the corner of the room. He grabbed a heavy bottle of vintage champagne, popping the cork with a violent celebratory explosion. The bubbly liquid spilled carelessly over the edges as he quickly filled 3 crystal flutes, completely ignoring my presence on the wooden chair. He handed a glass to Vivian and another to Dominique, who had finally looked up from her phone. "To the future," Brad declared loudly, raising his glass high in the air. "To reclaiming what is rightfully ours, to the success of Apex Holdings, and to finally taking out the trash." Dominique clinked her crystal glass against his, taking a long, triumphant sip. "I genuinely have to admit," she sneered, looking down at me with unfiltered contempt. "I thought you would put up a hell of a lot more fight than this. We prepared for a massive legal battle. We thought you would scream and threaten us with the police. But you just rolled over and handed us the keys to the absolute kingdom. You really are exactly as weak, stupid, and utterly pathetic as we always said you were." Brad took a slow, arrogant swallow of his champagne and walked deliberately toward me. The heavy, suffocating scent of expensive alcohol and designer cologne washed over me as he invaded my personal space. He leaned down, placing his large hands aggressively on the armrests of my wooden chair, physically trapping me in place. I kept my eyes locked submissively on the floorboards, physically shrinking away from his imposing frame. He reached out and grabbed my chin, his fingers digging painfully into my jawline. He forced my face up so I had no choice but to look directly into his smug, hateful eyes. "You actually believed you belonged in our world," Brad whispered, his breath hot against my skin. His voice dripped with a sickening, casual malice laced with the kind of deep-seated racism he normally reserved for closed doors among his wealthy peers. "You really thought you could just marry into legacy? You were nothing but a temporary diversity project for Marcus." an exotic little distraction to make him feel progressive. But blood always corrects itself in the end. You are going back exactly where you came from. You are going to be penniless, invisible, and completely worthless. Do not ever forget your place again, Nia. He released my chin with a sharp, disdainful shove. I let my head fall back down, wrapping my arms around my stomach, my body shaking as if I had been physically devastated by his cruel words. But if anyone had been looking closely, if a tracking camera had zoomed in on my face in that exact fraction of a second, they would have seen the absolute opposite of defeat. They would have seen my lips twitch into a tiny, razor-sharp smile. My eyes were entirely devoid of tears, burning with a cold, predatory, and deeply calculating intelligence. Underneath the long, drab sleeve of my gray dress, I was wearing Marcus's heavy titanium smartwatch. I had activated the primary recording application the exact moment I sat down in the chair. Every single threat they made, every casual admission of forgery, every vile, racially motivated insult, and their gleeful, arrogant celebration of the grand theft was currently being captured in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. The digital file was actively, silently syncing to my secure offshore cloud server. They were literally narrating their own federal indictments, providing Agent Miller with the undeniable audio confession to accompany the forged signatures. Brad finished his champagne in one final aggressive gulp. He looked at the empty crystal glass in his hand, then looked down at me with utter disgust. With a casual, deliberate flick of his wrist, he dropped the expensive glass directly onto the hardwood floor at my feet. It shattered loudly into 100 glittering pieces, the sharp crystal shards bouncing against my cheap shoes. "Clean that up," Brad ordered, coldly turning his back on me. "And make sure the main hall is absolutely spotless." The caterers and the event planners arrive at dawn for the final walkthrough. "Do not let me catch you sleeping on the job." Vivian linked her arms smoothly through Brad's, and Dominique followed close behind, laughing softly to themselves as they exited the living room. They headed toward the grand staircase, eager to continue their morbid celebration in the luxurious comfort of the upper levels, utterly convinced they had just won the war. I remained perfectly still, waiting until their heavy footsteps completely faded into the distant corridors of the estate. The moment the house fell silent, I stood up from the rigid wooden chair. My spine snapped perfectly straight. The act of the broken weeping widow was instantly discarded, evaporating into the cold air. I rolled my shoulders back and let out a long, slow breath. I walked over to the hallway supply closet, retrieved a heavy broom and a metal dustpan, and returned to silently sweep up the shattered crystal at my feet. As I disposed of the broken glass, I walked past Brad's temporary staging desk situated in the far corner of the room. A thick leather-bound clipboard sat open under the warm glow of a brass reading lamp. It was the master itinerary and highly classified security clearance list for tomorrow's memorial gala. I set the broom aside and stepped closer, the soft light illuminating the dense pages of text. I flipped past the aggressive catering schedules, the detailed floral arrangements, and the valet parking logistics, stopping directly on the VIP guest registry. I scanned the names, my finger tracing down the freshly printed ink. My eyes locked onto the very first name on the list, printed in bold, heavily emphasized letters. The governor of the state of Georgia was confirmed to attend. He was heavily scheduled to give a 30-minute keynote address, honoring Marcus's legacy, standing right beside Brad on the main stage in front of hundreds of people. The sheer catastrophic scale of what was about to happen took my breath away. Brad was not just going to launder $10 million in stolen funds in front of a few local oblivious investors. He was going to execute a massive federal financial crime tied directly to extortion, systemic forgery, and a brutal assassination while standing shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful, heavily guarded political figure in the entire state. I closed the heavy leather clipboard and reached over to turn off the brass reading lamp, plunging the corner of the room into total darkness. A deep, resonant thrill settled into my bones. Everything was perfectly aligned. The trap was fully set, the bait was swallowed, and the audience was gathered. Tomorrow night, the entire foundation of Atlanta's elite would have a front row seat to watch the Sterling family burn to absolute ashes. The sprawling estate had completely metamorphosed overnight. By late afternoon, the quiet suburban mansion was a frantic, vibrating hive of high society preparation. Catering crews wearing crisp white uniforms marched through the hallways carrying towering silver trays of imported caviar and seared Wagyu beef. Florists shouted instructions over the din, arranging massive, cascading displays of white lilies and orchids around the grand staircase. Sound engineers were aggressively testing the acoustics in the main ballroom, sending sharp bursts of static and heavy bass thumping through the floorboards. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the aggressive floor wax Vivian had demanded the staff use. I navigated through the labyrinth of controlled chaos, rendering myself entirely invisible. I kept my head bowed, my shoulders slumped forward, playing the role of the broken domestic servant to absolute perfection. Vivian had intentionally banished me to the heavy grunt work, ordering me to haul boxes of premium vintage champagne from the subterranean wine cellar up to the main staging area. My arms ached, and my fingers were raw, but the physical exhaustion was entirely overridden by the electric humming anticipation pulsing through my veins. The air in the house felt heavy, charged with the distinct metallic pressure of an approaching hurricane. With less than 2 hours until the first black cars were scheduled to roll up the long sweeping driveway, Vivian ordered me into the oversized pantry storage room adjacent to the main kitchen. She demanded I hand polish 50 silver serving platters because the catering staff had supposedly left smudges on the rims. The storage room was incredibly cramped, stacked floor to ceiling with extra folding chairs, bulk catering supplies, and discarded cardboard packing materials. The moment I crossed the threshold, the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud. The harsh fluorescent bulb overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the narrow room. I turned around slowly. Brad stood leaning against the heavy wooden door, completely blocking the only exit. He was already dressed for the gala. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo with silk lapels that practically screamed generational wealth. His hair was slicked back flawlessly, and his expensive cologne instantly overpowered the smell of cardboard and dry goods in the small room. But beneath his immaculate exterior, a frantic, manic energy vibrated off him in waves. He was sweating slightly, his jaw clenching and unclenching. He looked like a man standing on the absolute peak of a mountain, utterly convinced he was a god who could fly. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing me to back up until my spine pressed hard against the cold metal shelving unit behind me. The space between us evaporated. He wanted me to feel trapped. He wanted me to feel the full weight of his perceived power. "You look absolutely pathetic," Brad stated, his eyes sweeping over the drab, shapeless gray dress Dominique had forced me to wear. "It is almost poetic. You are finally dressed exactly how you were always meant to be dressed. A cheap, miserable charity case standing in the shadow of your betters." I did not respond. I kept my eyes locked submissively on the collar of his pristine white dress shirt, wrapping my arms defensively around my stomach. I let my breathing become shallow and erratic, performing the terror he so desperately wanted to see. "Tonight is the most important night of my entire life," Brad continued, his voice dropping to a low, aggressive whisper as he took another step closer. "The governor is arriving in an hour. The most elite political and financial power brokers in the entire state of Georgia are currently driving to my house. And in front of all of them, I am going to officially announce the Apex Holdings merger. I am going to solidify my status as a billionaire. I am going to be untouchable." He leaned in his face, mere inches from mine, his eyes burning with a toxic, predatory gleam. "And you are going to help me seal the deal." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy slip of paper. He snapped it open and shoved it directly into my line of sight. It was an oversized novelty bank check, the kind used for highly publicized charitable donations. It was made out to me, signed with Brad's sweeping, arrogant signature. The amount written across the center was $20,000, a microscopic drop in the bucket compared to the $10 million he had stolen from my husband. It was an absolute insult, a calculated public humiliation disguised as profound generosity. I stared at the check, letting my lower lip tremble violently. The media is setting up their cameras in the main ballroom right now, Brad whispered, a sick, satisfied smile stretching across his face. After the governor speaks, I am going to take the stage. I am going to give a beautiful, heartbreaking speech about my dear departed brother-in-law. I am going to tell the world how much Marcus meant to me. And then I am going to call you up to the podium. He reached out and grabbed my chin, his fingers digging painfully into my skin, forcing my head up. Tonight you will go on stage, accept a $20,000 charity check from me. Cry and thank me in front of the press. Brad commanded, his voice laced with absolute chilling malice. You are going to look into those cameras and tell the world that I am the savior of this family. You are going to play the grateful, destitute widow perfectly. Make one mistake, one single slip-up, and I will have someone destroy your entire future. I will make sure you are blacklisted from every job in this city. I will crush you until there is nothing left. I stared into his eyes, projecting utter paralyzing fear. But beneath that mask of submission, my mind was functioning with the cold, brutal precision of a sniper. Pinned directly to the collar of my ugly gray dress was a vintage pearl brooch. Marcus had given it to me on our first anniversary. Brad thought it was just a pathetic, sentimental accessory. He had absolutely no idea that the pearl had been hollowed out 48 hours ago by Isaiah Sterling's private security team. Inside that tiny pearl was a military-grade high-definition audio transmitter. The device was fully activated. The signal was actively streaming on an encrypted federal frequency. Less than half a mile down the road, hidden in the shadows of a heavily wooded cul-de-sac, a fleet of unmarked black utility vans was parked in complete silence. Inside those vans, Agent Miller and a heavily armed FBI strike team were sitting with their headphones pressed tightly to their ears, listening to every single syllable Brad was arrogant enough to speak. He was handing them a live recorded confession of witness intimidation and extortion, neatly tying a bow around the massive federal fraud case we had constructed. He was digging his own grave with a silver spoon. A tiny, nearly imperceptible click vibrated deep inside my right ear canal. It was the microscopic earpiece Isaiah had provided. The single click was the predetermined signal from Agent Miller. The audio feed was perfect. They had everything they needed. The strike team was officially standing by. Brad released my chin with a rough shove, stepping back to admire his own intimidation tactics. Do we have an absolute understanding, Nia? He demanded, smoothing out the lapels of his tuxedo. You cry. You say thank you. You take the money. Or you lose everything. I let my arms drop slowly to my sides. The trembling in my shoulders ceased entirely. I straightened my spine, rising to my full height. The broken, terrified widow vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by a woman forged in absolute unyielding fire. The sudden, drastic shift in my posture caused Brad to physically flinch, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second as he registered the cold, dead calm completely taking over my features. I raised my hands, stepping smoothly into his personal space. He froze, momentarily paralyzed by the sudden role reversal. I reached up and calmly, deliberately adjusted the silk tie at his throat, pulling the knot perfectly tight. I looked him dead in the eyes, allowing a slow, chilling smile to spread across my face. Do not worry, brother-in-law. I whispered, my voice completely devoid of fear, vibrating with a dark, lethal promise. Tonight, I will give you a performance you will never forget for the rest of your life. The historic Atlanta mansion was drowning in a sea of artificial grace. The grand ballroom, a sweeping cavern of polished marble and gilded molding, had been transformed into a suffocating theater of vanity. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured, blinding light across a moving ocean of sequined designer gowns and tailored, bespoke tuxedos. A string quartet situated on the mezzanine played a somber, elegant melody that was entirely drowned out by the sharp, barking laughter of venture capitalists and the hollow, practiced chuckles of corrupt politicians. The air was thick with the scent of imported roasted duck vintage champagne and the toxic, intoxicating aroma of unearned wealth. I stood near the heavy velvet drapes at the far back of the room, holding a half-empty glass of sparkling water, letting my eyes perform a slow, methodical sweep of the crowd. Every political heavyweight, every socialite, every parasitic financial broker in the city was packed into the room, their faces stretched into identical predatory smiles. They were sipping premium liquor and exchanging business cards, completely oblivious to the fact that they were mingling inside an active, heavily monitored federal crime scene. Vivian and Dominique were working the room with the ruthless, practiced efficiency of seasoned con artists. They glided from table to table, their champagne flutes clinking against those of state senators and real estate tycoons. I watched Vivian lean in close to the wife of a prominent federal judge, pressing a diamond-ringed hand to her chest in a grotesque display of manufactured sorrow. Even from across the crowded ballroom, I could read her lips perfectly. She was spinning a tragic, completely fabricated narrative. She was painting me as a helpless, destitute parasite who had completely unraveled mentally and financially since Marcus passed. Dominique played her part flawlessly right beside her mother. She nodded in solemn agreement, occasionally rubbing her slightly rounded stomach to draw calculated sympathy for the unborn child she claimed belonged to her respectable, absent fiancé. It was the ultimate sickening deception. She was flaunting a pregnancy that was actually the product of a deeply hidden, incestuous affair with Brad, using the child as a prop to garner pity from Atlanta's elite. They pointed discreetly in my direction, shaking their perfectly coiffed heads with mock sorrow, ensuring everyone in the room viewed me as a pathetic, broken charity case. I felt the heavy, judgmental gazes of the high society guests sliding over me like physical weights. I was wearing the stiff, shapeless synthetic gray dress Dominique had thrown at my face in the Buckhead boutique. Next to the sea of emerald silk, crimson satin, and glittering diamonds, I looked exactly like the impoverished, tragic servant they desperately wanted me to be. Women draped in $30,000 couture gowns looked at me with thinly veiled disgust, quickly averting their eyes as if my perceived destitution were a highly contagious disease. I endured every single pitying glance. I absorbed the whispered insults echoing behind raised champagne glasses. I let the ugly, cheap fabric chafe against my skin, actively embracing the intense public humiliation because I possessed knowledge that rendered their opinions entirely irrelevant. Pinned securely to the drab gray collar of my dress was the vintage pearl brooch. It looked like a cheap, sentimental accessory holding on to a bygone era. No one in that room had the slightest idea that the pearl had been expertly hollowed out by Isaiah Sterling's private security team. Hidden inside the smooth white shell was a military-grade high-definition audio transmitter. Every hushed insult, every clinking glass, and every single lie Vivian and Dominique told was currently broadcasting directly to a secure receiver. Just beyond the wrought iron gates of the estate, hidden in the shadows of a wooded cul-de-sac, Agent Miller and a heavily armed FBI strike team sat in absolute silence, inside an unmarked black utility van, listening to every word. A sharp, piercing chime suddenly cut through the low, buzzing hum of the ballroom. Brad was tapping a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute standing center stage behind a grand mahogany podium adorned with cascading white lilies. The room instantly quieted, the sea of wealthy guests turning their collective attention toward the man of the hour. Brad adjusted his custom midnight blue tuxedo jacket, projecting the absolute pinnacle of aristocratic authority. He looked out over the crowd, his arrogant gaze sweeping past the local investors and locking directly onto the governor of Georgia, who was seated at the primary VIP table in the front row. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brad began, his voice projecting through the high-end acoustic system, dripping with false humility and heavily practiced grief. "We are gathered here tonight to honor an absolute titan. Marcus was more than just a brother-in-law to me. He was a mentor, a visionary, and a pioneer in the corporate world. His sudden tragic departure has left a massive void in our hearts and in the financial sector of this great city." Brad paused, looking down at his hands, executing a flawless, dramatic sigh. The crowd remained completely silent, hanging onto his every word, fully captivated by the performance. "But Marcus would not want us to dwell in the shadows of our grief. Brad continued, his voice steadily rising, gaining a powerful magnetic momentum. He would want us to build. He would want us to expand. Tonight is not just a memorial, it is the dawn of a completely new era. I am incredibly proud to officially announce that our firm has finalized a historic monumental merger with Apex Holdings. A sudden ripple of impressed murmurs and excited whispers washed over the ballroom. Brad smiled broadly, soaking in the unearned reverence of the room. The massive financial injection we have secured tonight will allow us to carry Marcus's profound legacy into the absolute stratosphere, Brad declared, gesturing expansively to the crowd. I invite every single one of you in this room to join us on this remarkable journey. The future belongs entirely to those with the courage to aggressively invest in it. The applause was immediate and deafening. Wealthy investors and politicians nodded in eager agreement, already mentally calculating their own potential profits. They were completely, utterly blind to the fact that Apex Holdings was a digital ghost, a phantom corporation I had meticulously created 48 hours ago to execute Brad's complete financial slaughter. He was standing on stage bragging to the governor about a merger that legally bound him to a $100 million penalty for fraud. Brad soaked up the thunderous applause for a long moment before raising his hands to gently quiet the room. His eyes scanned the crowd, bypassing the cheering politicians and the smiling socialites, his gaze cutting straight through the room until it locked directly onto me, standing in the shadows at the back of the hall. The predatory, triumphant smirk I had seen in the storage room returned to his face, sharp and completely devoid of mercy. He reached beneath the podium and pulled out an oversized, rigid piece of cardboard. It was the massive novelty bank check printed with my name and the insultingly low sum of $20,000. He held it up slightly, ensuring the press photographers gathered near the stage had a clear, unobstructed view of his supposed philanthropy. Brad cleared his throat on the microphone, his voice echoing loudly over the quieted crowd. Today, our family wants to show our generosity. Please welcome Nia to the stage. The spotlight slammed into me, a blinding column of harsh white light that cut through the dim, glittering ambiance of the ballroom. A heavy, expectant hush fell over the sea of wealthy guests. Hundreds of eyes pivoted simultaneously, locking onto the woman in the cheap synthetic gray dress standing by the velvet drapes. For a fraction of a second, the absolute stillness of the room was deafening. Then a slow, polite ripple of applause began to spread across the floor. It was the sound of pity. It was the sound of high society applauding their own perceived moral superiority. I stepped forward, my worn shoes sinking into the thick imported Persian rugs. The camera operators near the front of the stage immediately swiveled their heavy lenses in my direction, their flashbulbs firing in a rapid, blinding strobe effect. The bright flashes captured every agonizing step of my slow, deliberate march toward the podium. I kept my shoulders slumped, my gaze fixed firmly on the ground, allowing the crowd to drink in the image of a completely defeated, destitute widow. As I passed the primary VIP tables, the hushed whispers of Atlanta's elite washed over me. I heard the sharp, judging intake of breath from a state senator's wife. I caught the cruel, dismissive scoff of a venture capitalist who had once shaken Marcus's hand and called him a visionary. They were dissecting my appearance, analyzing my grief, and finding me utterly unworthy of the sterling name. I absorbed every single jagged insult, letting their collective contempt fuel the diamond-hard clarity crystallizing in my mind. I reached the base of the grand staircase leading up to the main stage. Vivian was seated at a table positioned perfectly in the camera line of sight. She caught my eye as I placed my hand on the brass railing. She raised a lace handkerchief to her perfectly powdered cheek, dabbing at eyes that were completely dry. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, an Oscar-worthy performance of a grieving matriarch putting on a brave face. Dominique sat right next to her, swirling a glass of sparkling cider. As I walked past their table, Dominique leaned back in her chair and let out a soft, melodic giggle that cut right through the polite applause. She was practically vibrating with malicious joy, absolutely thrilled to witness my public execution. I climbed the carpeted steps, the heat from the massive stage lighting instantly pressing down on my skin. Brad stood directly behind the mahogany podium, looking like a king surveying his conquered territory. He held the oversized, rigid cardboard check in both hands, angling it precisely so the bold $20,000 figure caught the glare of the press cameras. As I approached the center of the stage, Brad stepped out from behind the podium. He plastered a look of profound, deeply manufactured sorrow across his face. He reached out and placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder, giving me a firm squeeze that was meant to look supportive to the audience, but was actually a bruising physical warning to stay exactly in line. Nia, Brad said into the microphone, his voice echoing with rehearsed honeyed sympathy. Our family knows that the past few weeks have been an unimaginable nightmare for you. Marcus's passing has left us all entirely shattered. But we also know that you are facing incredibly steep, difficult challenges as you attempt to navigate the world without his protection and without his resources. The crowd murmured in solemn agreement. The governor of Georgia, seated in the front row, nodded slowly, his face arranged in a mask of political compassion. We want you to know that you are not entirely forgotten. Brad continued, his voice swelling with magnificent fake generosity. The Sterling family protects its own, even those who were only with us for a fleeting tragic moment. This firm and this family wants to ensure you do not walk away empty-handed. Brad turned fully toward me, thrusting the massive, embarrassing cardboard check directly into my chest. I reached up slowly, my hands trembling violently as I gripped the thick, glossy edges of the novelty prop. The camera shutters fired in an aggressive frenzy, capturing the exact moment the billionaire titan bestowed his gracious charity upon the helpless, grieving widow. Please accept this small token of our immense generosity, Brad announced to the breathless room, his voice booming through the speakers. We hope this financial contribution helps you rebuild your life, find a quiet place to heal, and start over completely fresh. He paused, leaning in close. His mouth was mere inches from my ear, hidden from the cameras by the angle of his body. The microphone picked up his steady breathing, but not the venomous whisper that followed. Take the money, smile for the cameras, and never bother this family again. Brad hissed, his breath hot against my cheek. Say thank you, walk off this stage and disappear, or I swear to God I will bury you so deep you will never see daylight again. Brad pulled back instantly, replacing his lethal glare with a warm, encouraging smile for the press. He gestured toward the microphone mounted on the podium, offering me the floor to deliver the tearful, broken statement of gratitude he had strictly commanded me to perform. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Vivian leaned forward in her seat, clutching her lace handkerchief. Dominique smirked, raising her glass in a silent, mocking toast. The political power brokers, the corrupt investors, the oblivious socialites, they were all waiting for the final act of my public humiliation. They were waiting for me to break. I stood frozen in the center of the stage, my hands gripping the edges of the $20,000 check. I looked down at the bold ink, staring at Brad's sweeping, arrogant signature. I felt the tiny vintage pearl brooch resting against my collarbone. I felt the silent, rhythmic pulse of the hidden audio transmitter actively streaming every single second of this event directly to Agent Miller and the federal strike team waiting in the dark. The silence stretched out, growing tight and uncomfortable. Brad's smile began to look slightly strained. He gave me a sharp, subtle nod, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, impatient warning. I did not cry. The violent trembling in my hands ceased immediately. I slowly raised my head, letting the heavy curtain of unkempt hair fall away from my face. I looked past Brad. I looked past the governor. I locked my eyes directly down the barrel of the primary network news camera positioned at the back of the room. The absolute dead calm that washed over my features caused a sudden, uneasy ripple to spread through the front row of the audience. I shifted my grip on the oversized cardboard check. I placed my right hand firmly on the top edge and my left hand on the bottom. Brad noticed the shift in my posture. His brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Nia, he muttered under his breath, stepping quickly toward me. What are you doing? I did not answer him. I dug my fingers into the rigid cardboard, engaging every ounce of strength in my arms. With a sudden, explosive motion, I twisted my wrists in opposite directions. The heavy cardboard check ripped down the middle with a loud, violent tearing sound that echoed through the high-end acoustic microphones and blasted out across the silent ballroom. The room collectively gasped. A woman in the second row let out a sharp cry of shock. Vivian dropped her lace handkerchief, her jaw falling slack. Dominique froze her glass of sparkling cider, stopping halfway to her mouth. I tore the check completely in half, rendering Brad's signature into unrecognizable, jagged pieces. I held the two halves up for the cameras for one long, agonizing second. Then, with a look of absolute, unfiltered disgust, I dropped the torn pieces directly onto the polished mahogany stage, letting them flutter down to rest against Brad's expensive custom Italian leather shoes. Brad stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The shock of my blatant defiance had completely short-circuited his brain. He reached out blindly, trying to cover the microphone. I did not give him the chance. I stepped aggressively into his personal space, my shoulder slamming hard into his chest, knocking him completely off balance. I reached out and snatched the heavy silver microphone right out of his hand, ripping the cord free from the podium clip. I turned back to face the sea of horrified, paralyzed guests, the bright glare of the spotlights illuminating my cold, unyielding smile. "Thank you, brother-in-law," I said, my voice ringing out through the massive speakers, crystal clear, sharp, and totally commanding. "Since the press and your investors are all here, I also have a return gift for your company." I raised my hand high above my head and snapped my fingers. The sharp, singular sound barely carried over the low hum of the ballroom, but the technological response was absolutely instantaneous. The massive wraparound LED screens that lined the ornate walls of the venue flickered violently. The pristine gold and midnight blue logo of Brad's company distorted, glitching out in a frantic wave of pixelated static before being entirely wiped clean. In its place, a sea of glaring neon red documents illuminated the opulent room. The sudden shift in lighting painted the faces of the wealthy guests in a harsh crimson glow. Huge magnified images of offshore bank transfers flooded the screens. The $10 million wire route from Marcus's private accounts directly into shell companies, controlled entirely by Vivian and Brad, was traced in thick, undeniable red lines. Next to the financial statements, a high-resolution, side-by-side forensic analysis of Marcus's signature appeared. The forged codicil they had forced me to sign was displayed right next to a genuine legal document. Bold digital arrows pointed out the exact discrepancies I had noticed days ago. The wrong slant, the hesitant pressure, the incorrect connecting strokes. It was a brutal, undeniable visual dissection of a massive federal crime. The ballroom erupted into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The polite, hushed atmosphere of high society shattered instantly. State senators bolted out of their velvet chairs, spilling vintage champagne onto the imported rugs as they desperately tried to physically distance themselves from the stage. Venture capitalists who had just been applauding Brad's supposed genius were now frantically pulling out their phones, shouting at their brokers to freeze any pending transfers and kill the deals. The string quartet stopped playing with a screeching halt. Down in the front row, Vivian collapsed back into her seat as if all the bones in her body had suddenly evaporated. Her face drained of all color, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her expensive clutch onto the marble floor. Dominique let out a high-pitched, terrified shriek, staring up at the screens as if the glowing red numbers were physically burning her eyes. She grabbed her stomach instinctively, curling inward as the eyes of the elite turned from pitying her to analyzing her complicity. Brad spun around, staring at the massive screens looming over us. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff silk collar. He turned back to me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The heavy layers of his expensive cologne were suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, acrid scent of his own panic. "Cut the feed!" Brad bellowed, his voice cracking as he waved his arms frantically toward the sound booth on the mezzanine. "Turn the screens off right now. Security. Get this crazy woman off my stage. She is having a psychotic break. Turn the power off immediately." But the security guards lining the perimeter of the room did not move a single muscle. They stood perfectly still, their hands resting near their tactical belts. They were not Brad's men anymore. Isaiah had ensured the entire detail was quietly replaced by off-duty federal contractors hours before the gala even began. No one was coming to save him. I gripped the heavy silver microphone tighter, stepping forward to the very edge of the stage, ensuring my voice absolutely dominated the panicked roar of the crowd. "Allow me to properly introduce myself to the investors in the room," I announced, my voice cutting through the chaos like a steel blade. "Brad just spent the last 20 minutes selling you on his historic game-changing merger with the elusive, brilliant venture capital firm known as Apex Holdings." I paused, letting my cold, unyielding gaze sweep over the terrified faces of my family, finally locking onto Brad's sweating, horrified face. "I am Apex Holdings." Brad stumbled backward, his expensive Italian leather shoe catching on the torn pieces of the novelty check I had thrown on the ground. He looked at me, as if I had just grown a second head, his brain entirely incapable of processing the magnitude of his own defeat. "Yes, Brad," I continued, stepping relentlessly toward him, projecting every single syllable with lethal clarity. "The shadowy corporate entity that just agreed to absorb your failing, severely mismanaged company is entirely owned and operated by me. You thought you were laundering $10 million of my dead husband's blood money into a legitimate empire. You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else. Instead, you wired every single stolen cent directly into a financial trap designed specifically for you." He shook his head rapidly, his hands trembling. "No," he gasped out, his voice thin and reedy. "No, that is impossible. Vance vetted the contracts, the lawyers checked everything. And the best part is the paperwork you forced me to sign this very afternoon in the living room," I declared, pointing directly at his chest. "While you were busy gloating, drinking champagne, and handing me $20,000 to disappear, you authorized the final merger documents. You legally bound your entire estate to the Apex portfolio. But you were so blinded by your own greed that you failed to read the fine print regarding fraudulent disclosures. By funding this merger with stolen, heavily contested assets, you triggered a penalty clause that requires you to forfeit 10 times the principal amount for gross financial fraud." The entire ballroom fell dead silent, the sheer scale of the legal checkmate hanging heavily in the air. "You owe me $100 million, Brad," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that sent a visible shudder through his frame. "And since you do not have that kind of liquid capital, the contract dictates a total immediate liquidation. I am officially seizing your company, your personal bank accounts, your offshore trusts, and the very house you are currently standing in. I am taking every single thing you own, and I'm acquiring it all for exactly $1. The color completely drained from Brad's face, replaced instantly by a dark, violently mottled red. His entire world, his unearned wealth, his arrogant pride, and his criminal freedom had just been entirely incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the state. He had nothing left but his own toxic fury. A raw, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage ripped from his throat. He completely snapped. His hands balled into tight fists, and he lunged forward, launching his massive frame directly at me, intending to beat me to death right there on the mahogany stage. But before his hands could even reach my throat, the towering, heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom were violently kicked open, slamming against the marble walls with an explosive, deafening crash. The deafening crash of the heavy oak doors echoed like a bomb detonating inside the cavernous, gilded ballroom. A tidal wave of heavily armed tactical officers flooded the venue, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They wore dark, heavy tactical vests, with FBI emblazoned in bold, reflective yellow lettering across their chests and backs. The polite, aristocratic hush of Atlanta's high society was instantly obliterated by a chorus of panicked screams and the harsh barking orders of federal agents securing the perimeter. Elite guests who just seconds ago had been politely applauding my supposed ruin now scattered like roaches. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the imported marble floors, spraying expensive liquor into the air as venture capitalists, state senators, and wealthy socialites dove for cover behind overturned banquet tables. The illusion of safety and power was entirely shattered. Agent Miller led the strike team, his steely eyes locked entirely on the main stage. Brad was already midair, a feral guttural scream ripping from his throat. His expensive midnight blue tuxedo jacket flared out behind him as his hands reached out like claws aiming directly for my neck. He intended to kill me right there in front of 100 witnesses. He never made it. Agent Miller hit the stage like a runaway freight train. He intercepted Brad's trajectory, launching his own body forward and tackling the billionaire titan in mid-flight. The impact was brutal. Miller drove Brad's shoulder violently into the polished mahogany floorboards with a sickening thud that reverberated through the damaged microphone resting near my feet. The air was knocked completely out of Brad's lungs in a harsh, wheezing gasp. Before he could even attempt to recover, two more heavily armored agents swarmed him. They pinned his tailored suit against the hard wood, pressing their knees aggressively between his shoulder blades. Brad thrashed wildly, kicking his polished leather shoes against the stage and screaming obscenities. He fought with the desperate, pathetic frenzy of a cornered predator, realizing its absolute reign was over. "Stop resisting right now!" Agent Miller shouted over the deafening din of the panicked crowd, driving his knee sharper into Brad's spine to subdue his thrashing. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly, a sound that signaled the definitive end of the Sterling Empire. "Brad Sterling, you are under arrest." Miller grabbed the collar of Brad's ruined jacket and hauled the struggling, sweating man to his knees, forcing him to face the very audience he had just been attempting to manipulate and defraud. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal financial fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit property embezzlement, and the direct forgery of medical and legal records. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it." Brad's face was a grotesque mask of spit sweat and unadulterated fury. He glared up at me, his eyes bloodshot and bulging from their sockets, looking nothing like the untouchable titan of industry he pretended to be. He looked exactly like the cheap parasitic thief I had always known he was. The agents hauled him roughly to his feet, yanking his arms painfully up behind his back. The press photographers, recovering from their initial shock and realizing they were witnessing the scoop of a lifetime, rushed the edge of the stage. The blinding strobe of dozens of flashbulbs captured Brad's humiliating descent, immortalizing his arrest and his terrified, furious expression for tomorrow's front pages across the globe. Down on the main floor, the chaos was rapidly mutating into a completely different kind of horrific spectacle. The massive LED screens behind me, which had been displaying the red-inked offshore bank transfers, automatically cycled to the next slide in my carefully orchestrated digital presentation. The ominous red glow shifted to a stark, clinical, blinding white. Projected at 50 times its normal size, a certified DNA paternity report illuminated the room. I had paid a private investigator a small fortune to secure medical waste from Brad's private office and Dominique's exclusive prenatal clinic. The laboratory results were displayed in undeniably bold black text, confirming a 99.9% probability that Brad Sterling was the biological father of Dominique's unborn child. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the audience, far louder than the reaction to the financial fraud. Embezzlement was a crime the wealthy could understand, but incest was a depravity that completely shattered their delicate social sensibilities. I watched a tall, sharply dressed man standing frozen near the primary VIP tables. It was Julian Dominique's respectable, incredibly wealthy fiancé. The man she had paraded around all evening as her golden ticket to high society legitimacy, using his good name to mask her dark secrets. Julian stared up at the glowing white screen, his eyes tracking the medical data over and over. His face transformed rapidly from initial confusion to absolute sickening realization and finally to pure disgust. He slowly turned his head to look down at his glowing bride-to-be. Dominique was hyperventilating. She gripped the edge of her overturned table, her knuckles stark white, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She was desperately searching for a lie, any lie to cover the undeniable biological truth glaring down at them from the massive screens. Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Dominique reached out a trembling manicured hand, her voice shrill and panicked, echoing over the noise of the federal agents. She begged him to listen, weeping hysterically, claiming the screens were hacked, claiming it was all a vicious, jealous setup designed by me to ruin her happiness. Julian did not say a single word. He did not yell or argue. He simply raised his right hand and delivered a sharp, resounding slap across her perfectly contoured cheek. The sound cracked like a whip over the immediate crowd, cutting through Dominique's pathetic excuses. The sheer force of the blow sent Dominique stumbling backward. She crashed into a stunned waiter, taking a silver tray of empty champagne glasses down to the marble floor with her in a loud, shattering cascade of crystal. "The wedding is permanently off!" Julian spat, his voice laced with a quiet, lethal revulsion that carried farther than any shout. "Do not ever contact me again. You make me physically sick." He turned on his heel, adjusted his tuxedo jacket, and stormed out of the ballroom, his private security detail rushing to clear a path for him. He did not look back once. Dominique scrambled to her knees amid the broken glass, screaming his name. Her perfectly styled, expensive hair fell in messy, ruined clumps across her tear-streaked face. The glittering diamond tiara she had worn to signify her aristocratic status slipped from her head, hitting the floor and breaking apart. But her elite friends, the very people she had toasted with sparkling cider just minutes ago, did not rush forward to help her up. Instead, the socialites, influencers, and politicians who had eagerly consumed her manufactured grief pulled out their smartphones. A dozen camera lenses pointed directly at Dominique, recording her sobbing, ruined breakdown. The polished, aristocratic crown she had worn all her life was completely pulverized, crushed beneath the weight of her own sickening depravity. She was crying hysterically, throwing her hands up to hide her face from the relentless flashes, realizing with absolute clarity that her total social annihilation was being broadcast live to the very circles she worshipped. She was a pariah. The ballroom was a total war zone. Federal agents were barking orders, securing the perimeter, interviewing panicked investors, and dragging a continuously screaming, thrashing Brad out through the heavy service corridors. I stood perfectly still on the center of the stage, the chaos swirling wildly beneath me. I felt a profound, chilling sense of absolute peace settling into my bones. I had systematically dismantled their empire, their false reputations, and their unearned freedom. I had burned their world to ash. Then a slow, pathetic movement at the base of the grand stage caught my attention. It was Vivian. The proud, untouchable matriarch of the Sterling family was no longer standing tall. Her incredibly expensive custom silk gown was torn at the hem, stained with spilled wine and dirt from the floor. Her flawless, age-defying makeup was running in dark, jagged, mascara-stained streaks down her cheeks. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes wide with shock. She had just witnessed her golden-favored son being hauled away like a common street thug in federal handcuffs. She had just watched her precious daughter become a viral, incestuous laughingstock, abandoned by her wealthy fiancé. Vivian slowly turned her gaze back up to the massive LED screens. The red financial documents were still glowing brightly on the auxiliary monitors, verifying beyond any shadow of a doubt that her personal bank accounts were entirely frozen, seized, and completely empty. The sheer crushing reality of her absolute irreversible destitution finally broke her mind. Her entire identity was tied to her wealth and her power over others. Now she had exactly nothing. Vivian stumbled forward, her legs giving out completely. She fell hard onto the bottom step of the mahogany stairs, her hands scrambling for purchase against the carpet. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she crawled. The woman who had treated me like dirt, who had plotted to steal my dead husband's legacy, who had looked at me as if I were a contagious disease, was now dragging herself up the stairs like a wounded, desperate insect. She reached the top of the stage, her breathing ragged and shallow. She threw her body forward across the final distance, her arms reaching out and wrapping tightly around my calves. She buried her tear-soaked, ruined face against the cheap synthetic fabric of my gray dress. "Nia, my child, I am so sorry." Vivian sobbed her voice, a pathetic broken wheeze that sounded nothing like her usual commanding tone. Brad tricked me. He lied to me about everything. Please, Nia. She tilted her head up, her eyes begging, her hands clinging to me as if I were the last life raft in a boiling ocean. You have to save our family. I looked down at the woman who had made it her absolute mission to turn my life into a living hell. The heavy stage lights beat down on us, casting harsh shadows across Vivian's tear-streaked, ruined face. For years, I had cowered under her cruel gaze. I had swallowed her insults, accepted her scraps, and believed the poisonous narrative she spun about my worth. Now she was literally crawling at my feet, her manicured hands clutching the cheap fabric of my dress like a drowning sailor clinging to a raft. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute clarity. I deliberately shifted my weight and pulled my leg back, forcing her hands to slip off my calves. Vivian collapsed fully onto the hardwood stage, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my face locked into an emotionless mask. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to endure the agonizing weight of the public spectacle she had originally designed for me. You were absolutely right, Vivian, I said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom with lethal precision. You always told me I did not belong in your world. You told me I was not refined enough, not ruthless enough, not worthy of the sterling name or the sterling wealth. You were right. I do not belong in your fake, fragile world. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the terrified faces of the Atlanta elite before bringing it back down to the broken woman at my feet. I am the one who bought it. Vivian shook her head rapidly, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The denial was written all over her face, her brain entirely incapable of processing the magnitude of her defeat. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gray dress and pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of legal documents. I held them up, letting the bright flashes of the press cameras capture the embossed seals of the federal bankruptcy court. This is the deed to the historic Buckhead mansion you are currently living in, I announced to the room. The very same estate you proudly bragged about renovating with Marcus's money. When Brad triggered the fraud penalty clause in our merger agreement tonight, all Sterling corporate and personal assets were immediately seized for liquidation to cover the $100 million deficit. The bank foreclosed on your primary residence exactly 1 hour ago. I looked directly into Vivian's horrified eyes, and Apex Holdings purchased the foreclosed debt. I own the house, Vivian. I own the cars. I own the offshore accounts you thought were untouchable. I own every single piece of designer jewelry you bought with stolen funds. I dropped the legal documents directly onto her lap. They landed with a heavy final thud. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property, I stated, my voice devoid of any sympathy. Do not attempt to take any artwork, any furniture, or any valuables, because federal agents will be waiting at the gates to inventory every single box. You are going to leave that mansion with absolutely nothing, just like you tried to do to me. I suggest you find a very cheap apartment. Go back to the slums you always despised and complained about. Your reign as the queen of Atlanta high society is officially over. The press photographers went absolutely wild. The rapid, blinding strobe of their flashbulbs illuminated Vivian's total collapse. She let out a hollow, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of her complete destitution finally broke her. Her career as a manipulative socialite, her hoarded money, and her manufactured honor were permanently erased in front of the entire city. Across the ballroom, the federal strike team had finally managed to subdue Brad. They hauled him forcefully to his feet, his hands securely locked in heavy steel cuffs behind his back. He was no longer screaming. His face was a mask of defeated, sullen shock as the agents dragged him through the center of the room. The wealthy guests, the politicians, and the venture capitalists physically recoiled from him, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits out of the way, as if his sheer proximity would infect them with bankruptcy and federal indictments. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. A profound, heavy silence settled over the grand ballroom. The string quartet was gone. The frantic whispering had stopped. The only sounds remaining were the soft clicks of camera shutters and the pathetic, ragged sobbing of Vivian and Dominique. They were left completely alone, two ruined women crying on the floor amidst the shattered crystal, the overturned banquet tables, and the absolute wreckage of the gala they had funded with blood money. The high society parasites they had tried to impress were now staring at them with unfiltered disgust, mentally deleting the Sterling family from their contact lists. I did not waste another second looking at them. I turned away from the stage and walked down the mahogany steps. As I moved across the expansive ballroom floor, something incredible happened. The sea of elite guests, the people who had spent the entire evening whispering cruel insults about my cheap dress and my perceived poverty, immediately parted for me. They stepped back, clearing a wide, unobstructed path toward the exit. State senators lowered their eyes. Wealthy socialites held their breath. No one dared to speak. No one dared to block my way. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound respect. I was no longer the helpless, destitute widow they could mock. I was the apex predator who had just systematically slaughtered their biggest titan. I kept my head held high, my shoulders squared, and my gaze fixed straight ahead. The synthetic gray dress no longer felt like a symbol of humiliation. It felt like battle armor. I walked through the grand foyer, leaving the suffocating smell of expensive perfume, stale champagne, and ruined lives far behind me. I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night air. The humidity had broken, and a gentle breeze swept across the massive stone courtyard. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine trees and absolute freedom. The heavy weight I had carried since the moment Marcus died was finally gone. Idling quietly at the base of the sweeping concrete driveway was a pristine midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The tinted windows gleamed under the soft glow of the estate's exterior lighting. Standing directly beside the open rear passenger door, leaning casually on an elegant silver-tipped cane, was Isaiah Sterling. The reclusive billionaire looked exactly as commanding and authoritative as he had in the private boardroom weeks ago. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the ambient light. He watched me approach, his sharp, calculating eyes, missing absolutely nothing. As I reached the car, a slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pride. He did not offer meaningless condolences or unnecessary praise. He simply stepped back, gesturing toward the luxurious leather interior of the vehicle. He knew exactly what I had accomplished in that ballroom. He knew the Sterling family name had been ruthlessly purged of its rot. I met his gaze, offering a small, silent nod of mutual respect. I slid into the back seat of the Phantom, the heavy door closing behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. The engine hummed to life, a deep, powerful vibration that resonated through the floorboards. As the car pulled away from the estate, leaving the flashing police lights and the ruined gala in the rearview mirror, I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The war was officially over. I had won. 6 months later, the gentle morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new midtown penthouse, casting a warm golden aura over the plush white leather sofa where I sat. If a camera were capturing this moment, it would be pulling back smoothly, expanding the frame to reveal the absolute luxury and quiet peace of the sprawling sanctuary I had built for myself. The heavy, suffocating darkness of the Sterling estate was a distant memory, replaced by the brilliant, limitless expanse of the Atlanta skyline. The legal fallout from the gala had been swift, brutal, and thoroughly devastating for the people who had tried to destroy me. Brad Sterling's spectacular public unraveling ended with a sharp gavel strike and a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His arrogance had finally met its match in federal prosecutors who stripped him of everything but his orange jumpsuit. Vivian and Dominique did not fare any better. Their total financial annihilation forced them directly back into the very same low-income working-class neighborhoods they had spent their entire privileged lives mocking and despising. Today, the former queens of Atlanta high society are employed by a budget commercial cleaning service. They spend their days scrubbing linoleum floors and emptying trash cans just to barely cover their monthly rent. I, on the other hand, officially took the helm of Apex Holdings. I am finally continuing Marcus's true, authentic legacy. Using the massive influx of recovered capital, I redirected the firm's entire focus to exclusively fund and empower brilliant women of color launching their own startup companies. We are building tables where we were once denied seats. I reached out and picked up a crystal glass of vintage red wine resting on the sleek glass coffee table. I raised it high, offering a toast to the empty room to Marcus and to anyone watching who has ever been made to feel small. The sweetest revenge is never found in screaming, crying, or throwing tantrums. It is found in the absolute disciplined silence required to meticulously prepare an irreversible sentence. Never let anyone else determine your price, and never apologize for outsmarting the wolves. If you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic people who severely underestimated your worth, share your story in the comments below and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of ultimate survival. As the smooth, sultry bass line of a classic R&B track begins to play echoing warmly through the penthouse, the brilliant morning skyline slowly fades to absolute black.